Good evening, everybody. I welcome all of you for today's webinar series in the month of September. And it's a wonderful start of the month of September that we have an expert from Hong Kong, and he is Dr. Raymond Kwun-Sun Lau. He is lecturer at History Department, Hong Kong Baptist University. He holds a PhD in political science from University of Queensland, Australia. His research interest includes Africa-China relationships, international responses to genocide and mass atrocities, politics of Hong Kong and China. He is author of Africa-China relationships in context of Belt and Road Initiative, realizing African-Chinese dreams for common development. So it's a wonderful opportunity to hear Raymond Lau for this webinar series that we have already started from the month of May with web platform for dialogue. I welcome Professor Dr. Raymond for this wonderful evening. And now I would request Dr. Raymond for starting the session, introducing today's particular topic of discussions and your presentation. Thank you so much. I welcome you for today's webinar series.
Okay, good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Swandi, for giving me this opportunity to share my insights. And also thank you very much for your very kind and generous introduction. I'm really glad to be here on this occasion, meeting many of you guys, many outstanding scholars, professors, and other audiences on this occasion. Really glad to be here. So basically, what I would like to do now is to share my insights on the topic that I'm supposed to speak for today. So the title that I'm speaking for today is called the BRICS and the implementation of the responsibility to protect, challenges and prospects. Dr. Swandi, I'm just wondering if I can share my PowerPoint.
Yeah, you can present now.
Yeah, because I just can't find the button.
At the bottom?
Okay, at the bottom.
At the bottom.
Present now?
At the bottom, present now.
Shall I choose a window or Chrome tab?
A window, yes. A window.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you guys see the PowerPoint slides that I'm showing? So you guys can see, right? Okay, so can you guys see?
Yes, it's can you respond first? Can you able to see?
Yeah, it's visible. It's clearly.
Just a moment. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so you guys can see my PowerPoint slides, correct?
Yes, sir. Can you please start sharing from the beginning, because I think there is some issue from my end. I can't able to see. So.
Okay. So I just try again.
Yes. Yeah. or else you can try with entire screen. I think sometime it problem with a window. Sometimes it happens.
Still. Yeah, I'm not sure why why I can't share my PowerPoint slides at my. Okay. Probably I'm not sure why I'm not able to share my PowerPoint slide, but perhaps maybe I can just start without the PowerPoint slides, and because of the time constraint.
So you can share it from down. Earlier it was quite visible, but now it's not visible. You just down there's a present now arrow. Just click on it. Am I audible? Am I audible? Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah, it's now it's clear.
Okay, you guys can
It's
see
clear
now.
It's visible.
Okay, so
Yeah, it's visible.
okay, so
Now it's coming.
okay, so I will just start. Okay, so again, as I mentioned, the topic in which I would like to share for today is about the implementation of the responsibility to protect, challenges and the prospects. So I think many of you may be aware of this. This year, 2020, actually marks the 15th anniversary of the adoption of what can be known as the responsibility to protect, in short form, R2P principle, at the 2005 United Nations World Summit. So that World Summit, that also marks the 60th anniversary for the establishment of the United Nations. So during that World Summit, virtually all the UN member states have unanimously endorsed this newly established R2P principle. And given that, as I mentioned, this year marks the 15th anniversary for the adoption of this R2P principle. So I think this is a good opportunity, for us, first of all, to revisit the effectiveness of this responsibility to protect principle since its adoption some 15 years ago. And in the meantime, in what many scholars suggest, the so-called post-Western world, in terms of the growing importance of the emerging powers, in particular the BRICS countries, I think it is also very important here for us to understand the views, particularly the BRICS countries, the views of the emerging powers on this very important issue relating to international responses to genocide and mass atrocities in this context of the R2P's principles adoption. So what I would like to do for today's webinar, I'm trying to do two things, time permitting. First is about making sense of the origins and the development of this R2P principle. And second, instead of giving you guys a general overview of the BRICS countries' stance, instead I would like to focus in particular, the policy stance of the Chinese government on the responsibility to protect principle. There are a number of reasons why I'm focusing entirely on China. I think first is, I think many of you may be aware of this, China is one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. And second, the reason why I'm focusing on China for this webinar is its position or its stance over the responsibility to protect principle has actually been changing and evolving from time to time. So I think it is actually quite interesting, okay, to see how China's policy stance on the R2P principle keeps evolving since the birth of this principle in the early 2000s. So the argument that I'm making, I'm trying to make here is, okay, despite an explicit unanimous endorsement of the R2P among the UN member states, okay, at the 2005 UN World Summit, the controversy surrounding the Pillar 3 responsibility, I'm going to explain a little bit more on what this so-called Pillar 3 responsibility means at a later stage. But anyway, so controversy over the Pillar 3 responsibility does reflect deeper contestation over the implementation of the R2P principle. So, in my opinion, engaging the emerging powers is crucial, okay, for the international community, okay, to translate the promise of R2P into practice. So basically, this is about protecting the world's vulnerable populations from the 4 specific crimes under the international law. So there is genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Okay, so before digging deep, okay, into the origins and development of the R2P principle, what I would like to do in terms of providing the historical background for the emergence of R2P is, I think it is very important, first of all, for us to understand this inherent tension existing, okay, between the preservation or the defense of state sovereignty and the protection of the fundamental or universal human rights since the establishment of the United Nations, okay, following the end of the Second World War. I think also, as many of you may be aware of this, since the establishment of the United Nations in 1945, I think it is fair for us to suggest its founder had been preoccupied with addressing the problem of the so-called interstate wars. So this is about addressing the problems of states waging war against each other. So that partially explains why the use of force among UN member states has been strictly prohibited under the UN Charter. In fact, there are only 2 exceptions that the use of military force is being seen as justifiable. Right? The one is the right of self-defense, according to Article 51 of the UN Charter, and the second is the UN Security Council authorization. So anyway, so the point that is worth highlighting here is, following the establishment of the United Nations, states no longer has the right to wage war against each other randomly or arbitrarily. And I think it is also fair for us to suggest, okay, given this context, the UN Charter, at least for the first 45 years during the entire Cold War period, the emphasis has almost always been placed on privileging on the defense or the preservation of state sovereignty over the protection of the universal human rights. There are some evidence, okay, suggesting this. The reason why state sovereignty was always being placed over human rights. For example, as we can see from the Article 2 verses 4 of the UN Charter. Okay, so this is what is said, and quote: all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any states, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purpose of the UN. So again, basically what we are seeing here is about the strict prohibition of the threat of use of force among UN member states. Okay, in this same token, okay, Article 2 versus 7. Basically, again, what this highlights is not even the United Nations, the world body itself, is eligible to intervene in the domestic affairs of its member states. Okay, and similarly, there has also been a number of declarations being issued on the UN level. For example, this 1965 Declaration on Inadmissibility of Intervention in the domestic affairs of states and the protection of their independence and sovereignty. Okay, so basically this is about reiterating the importance of the principle of state sovereignty and territorial integrity. Okay, also in a similar vein, this 1970 Declaration on Principles of International Law Concerning Friendly Relations and the Cooperation Among States. So this is also basically about highlighting the importance of the principle of sovereign inequality, as well as the principle of non-interference into the domestic affairs of states. Okay, but in parallel, with these efforts being made by the UN to defend and to preserve the state sovereignty, what we have witnessed during the same period is about the efforts being made by the UN to promote the protection of the universal human rights. And this, what we can see here is the adoption of the two very important international covenants on civil and political rights, as well as the economic, social, and cultural rights. So along with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, all these three very important documents are now being known as the International Bill of Human Rights. But because of the time constraints, I'm not going to dig deep into the contents of this human rights protection regime. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that despite the emergence of this so-called International Bill of Human Rights, seeing this from the benefit of hindsight, despite all these efforts being made by the UN for the promotion and protection of universal human rights, one thing that we can't take this for granted is the commission of genocide and mass atrocity is still pretty much as a recurring phenomenon. What I'm referring to here is the phenomenon of governments killing their own people within state borders. So in this context, so there are quite a number of questions that international policy makers have to think about. So there are three in which, in my opinion, are particularly important. Question number one is, should tyrannical states be accorded the protection afforded by the non-intervention principle? Question number two is, what happens if states behave as criminals towards their own people, as if treating sovereignty as a license to kill? Question number three is, should states be exposed to legitimate intervention if the governments actively abuse or fail to protect their people? In fact, these questions have become even more prominent or important following the end of the Cold War. And following the dramatic and the peaceful end of the Cold War, okay, what we have witnessed here, perhaps most importantly, is a dramatic shift, okay, in the nature of war. Particularly important here, perhaps, is the growing prominence of wars taking place within state borders, the so-called intra-state wars. In many ways, what we are witnessing here is the intra-state wars outnumbering, okay, the interstate wars, and the inevitable consequence, okay, for the growing the numbers of increase in the intra-state war is that is about the increasing numbers of civilians casualties, as well as the destruction of civilian infrastructure. Okay, so basically what the meaning here is civilians among, okay, these growing numbers of intra-state wars, so they have increasingly become the deliberate targets, okay, other than the accidental victims. Okay, and the reason partially is because on many occasions, states as well as the governments, there are possibilities for them to become the source of threat to their people. So this is basically the problems of the so-called states being the potential agents of human insecurity. So it is against this backdrop that this discussion and the debate surrounding the issue of humanitarian intervention has been revitalized, okay, particularly among the Western countries. Okay, it is against this backdrop that the so-called Western countries, okay, they had taken the lead in advancing a new norm of humanitarian intervention. Okay, particularly important here is the so-called the right to intervene, okay, in the domestic affairs of other countries. So here I would like to have a very brief discussion, okay, of some of the historical backgrounds for the emergence of the R2P principle. Okay, so as I just very briefly mentioned, okay, this commission of genocide and mass atrocities, okay, has almost always been a recurring phenomenon, particularly during the first half of the 20th century. Okay, for example, okay, the Turkey's wiping out of some 1.5 million Armenians in 1955 and 1915 and 1916 is widely acknowledged as the so-called first act of genocide in the 20th century. Okay, somewhat similarly, okay, Adolf Hitler's his so-called final solution, okay, to the Jewish people in terms of his systematic mass extermination of some 6 million Jews in Nazi concentration camp, okay, before and during the Second World War, is somewhat highlight, okay, the problem. As I mentioned, this is about the problem of governments killing their own people and within their state borders. Okay, in many ways, okay, the United Nations, its founder has not effectively, or it has not adequately addressed, okay, this phenomenon of governments killing their own people within state borders. And the reason is because of their preoccupation with addressing the problems of interstate wars other than the intrastate wars. In fact, quite a number of scholars has highlighted, okay, this dilemma facing the United Nations. For example, Simon Chesterman, okay, in his very prominent work written in 2001, Just War or Just Peace. So he called this controversy as what he called inhumanitarian non-intervention. So what he was referring to here in particular is the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, okay, in which I'm going to elaborate a bit more, okay, in a sec. So the controversy, okay, surrounding this 1994 Rwandan genocide perhaps is intervention did not take place because states did not want them to take place. Okay, somewhat similarly, again, Nicholas Willis, in his also very prominent work entitled "Saving Strangers," okay, he has highlighted the what we call the saving strangers dilemma. So basically, the meaning here is when states have chosen to intervene on humanitarian grounds, so-called doing something. Okay, in terms of doing something to rescue those people, okay, in those foreign countries, okay, that would likely to be provoke, okay, the charge of interference in the domestic affairs of another states. But at the same time, doing nothing, acting as passive bystanders, could also lead to accusation of moral interference. Indifference. Okay, so basically, okay, the controversy surrounding this issue is with states choosing to act or not to act, they have proven to be equally controversial. Okay, so anyway, this issue, okay, surrounding the humanitarian intervention in the early 1990s, following the end of the Cold War. I think in order for us to make this clear, so I'm here now borrowing, okay, this definition, okay, being used by J.L. Hascroft and Robert Cohen, okay, in this scholarly work called The Humanitarian Intervention: Ethical, Legal, and Political Dilemmas, written in 2003. So this is what the two scholars define the meaning of humanitarian intervention. So this is what they said, and I quote: okay, the threat or the use of force across state borders by a state or group of states aimed at preventing or ending widespread and grave violation of the fundamental human rights of individuals other than its own citizens without the permission of the states within whose territory force is applied. So I mean, there are three fundamental features in terms of understanding this so-called humanitarian intervention. First is it involves the use or the threat of the use of military force. Second, okay, is about preventing or stopping, okay, these fundamental human rights violations. Third is it is being done without, okay, the consent of the states. Okay, in fact, the 1990s, this is the period in which, okay, we have witnessed, okay, the UN Security Council, okay, in terms of its willingness, okay, to shoulder its responsibility to maintain the international peace and security. And it is somewhat a very radical departure from its practice, okay, during the Cold War period. In fact, the debate surrounding the humanitarian intervention could be understood, okay, in the two major schools of thoughts. Okay, the one school of thought is called the restrictionists. So for them, the humanitarian intervention, okay, doesn't have a role or doesn't have a place on UN Charter, because this is totally against the Article 2 versus 4, Article versus 7 of UN Charter, as I just very briefly mentioned. But for the second school of thought, okay, the counter-restrictionists, the so-called, they do think that, or they are convinced that, like, there is a legal right of unilateral and the collective humanitarian intervention for the United Nations. Okay, in many ways, this controversy surrounding the humanitarian intervention in the early 1990s could somewhat be understood as a so-called North-South issue. What I'm trying to say here is countries in the so-called developed world, or developed states, they tend to be very supportive of highlighting this so-called right to intervene or this right of humanitarian intervention, while countries in the South or countries in the developing world, they tend to be very critical or very skeptical of this so-called rights of humanitarian intervention. So it is also against this backdrop that we have witnessed some of the efforts being made by prominent scholars and policymakers to resolve this so-called North-South divide, or this debate surrounding this controversy of humanitarian intervention. One of these efforts is being made by Francis Ding with his advocacy, his idea of so-called sovereignty as responsibility. So in the eyes of Francis Ding, by the way, Francis Ding, he was made as the special advisor to the UN Secretary General on the prevention of genocide. He was also made the UN ambassador, representing South Sudan. Anyway, so for Francis Ding, there are two dimensions for understanding this sovereignty as responsibility idea. Dimension number one is a state is obliged to protect and assist its people in order to be qualified as a legitimate and a respected member of the international society. Dimension number two is there is obligation for the international community to provide the necessary assistance in the case when the state fails to discharge its responsibility for the affair of its citizens due to a lack of political will capacity. So the implications here are twofold. First is sovereignty has never meant to be licensed to kill. And second, implication number two is the international community cannot expect it to act as just the passive bystander. So also some other efforts being made by policymakers, for example, at the UN level. As we can see, Kofi Annan, in his 1999 very important article written for the Economist magazine. So he has advocated what they call the two concepts of sovereignty. So basically what he was trying to suggest here is state should be understood to be the sovereign servant of his people, not vice versa. So equally important in terms of understanding the importance of state sovereignty perhaps is the idea of individual sovereignty. So basically this is about highlighting the importance of the protection and preservation of individual freedom and the civil rights. So in Kofi Annan, in his further efforts to promote or to make this discussion and debate carrying on, so he has posed a very important questions for all the UN member states against the backdrop of the 1994 Rwandan genocide, when some 800,000 people were being massacred in just 100 days by the government. But by the same time, the UN did act as a passive bystander, doing nothing to stop or to prevent this genocide from taking place. So this is the question that he has posed for all the UN member states. This is what he said, I quote. So in those dark days and hours leading up to the genocide, a coalition of states had been prepared to act in defense of the Tutsi population, but did not receive prompt council authorization. So such coalition have stood aside and allowed the horror to unfold. So in responding to Kofi Annan's challenge, the Canadian government has embrace the challenge, okay, taking the initiative to set up, okay, the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, in short form the ICISS. And after some 12 months of efforts, okay, eventually the report, okay, entitled "The Responsibility to Protect," was released in December 2001. And this is in this context, okay, for the very first time, okay, this principle or this concept being known as the R2P, responsibility to protect, was born. Okay, and particularly important here, perhaps, which I would like to highlight here, is this very important paragraph that I have taken from this report. So this is what the report argues, as I quote: "State sovereignty implies responsibility, and the primary responsibility for the protection of its people lies with the state itself. Okay, where a population is suffering serious harm as a result of internal war, insurgency, repression, or state failure, and the state in question is unwilling, unable to harm or avert it, the principle of non-intervention yields to the international sovereignty to protect." So in just 4 years since the release of the ISIS report in 2001, okay, at this 2005 World Summit, okay, the largest ever gathering of heads and states and governments ever, as I said before, very briefly mentioned, okay, the United Nations member states, okay, they have virtually and unanimously endorsed, okay, this R2P concept. Right? And also, in a very important development here, in 2009, okay, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the time, okay, he has made the efforts in terms of further elaborating, okay, the R2P principle, okay, in what he called the three pillars principle. So according to Ban Ki-moon, okay, the R2P principle entails three mutually reinforcing pillars. Okay, pillar number one is each state bear the primary responsibility to protect its people, okay, from the 4 specific crimes under the international law: okay, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the ethnic cleansing. Okay, pillar number 2 is about highlighting the international community's responsibility to assist states to fulfill this protection responsibility. Okay, pillar 3 responsibility is that the international community has the responsibility to use all appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful means, okay, to protect the population from the above-mentioned crimes. And in case, or should those peaceful means be proved to be inadequate, okay, to tackle those issues, or in case when the national governments manifestly fail to protect their people, then the international community should be prepared to take, okay, what they call a timely and decisive action. Okay, that includes the use of enforcement measures authorized by the UN Security Council, the so-called Chapter 7 actions, in order to protect, okay, the populations from those 4 specific crimes. Okay, talking about the international community's commitment, okay, to the R2P principle. So here I think it's worth highlighting the 2 very important paragraphs here, the 138 and 139, taken from the World Summit outcome, okay, of the 2005 UN World Summit. So I think it's worth mentioning, repeating here, in terms of understanding the UN member states, okay, their unanimous commitment, okay, to the R2P principle. Okay, paragraph 138, which suggests, and I quote, okay, each individual state has the responsibility to protect its populations from, again, genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and the crimes against humanity. Okay, and then 139, the paragraph. Okay, and this is what I would like to highlight here. Okay, this is about highlighting the international community's role to carry out or to assume, okay, this protection responsibility in case of a state's unwillingness or inability to carry out, okay, the protection responsibility. Okay, so this is what is said, like, well, in this context, we are prepared to take collective action in a timely and decisive manner through the Security Council, okay, in accordance with the Charter, including Chapter 7, on a case-by-case basis, and in the cooperation with relevant regional organizations as appropriate, should peaceful means be inadequate and international authorities are manifestly failing to protect the population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. So now, I would like to bring you guys into attention to China's policy stance, okay, on the R2P principle. Again, as I just very briefly mentioned, okay, there are a number of reasons why it is necessary for us to understand or the focus of attention on China's government's changing position, okay, on this R2P principle. Okay, fundamental reason number one is China is one of the permanent members of within the UN Security Council, and so I mean it definitely has the right to exercise its veto powers. And fundamental reason number two is China is a rising global actor. So in this sense, China, or we say the world, does have some sort of expectation in terms of expecting China, okay, to bear greater responsibility in terms of maintenance of international peace and security. So in terms of understanding China's its changing position or its evolving position on the responsibility to protect principle, I think here it is very important for us to bear in mind here in terms of understanding China's position is this. With regards to the three pillars, okay, being advocated by Ban Ki-moon, as I just very briefly mentioned, by the UN Secretary General, okay, China tends to be very supportive, okay, of the Pillar 1 responsibility. So this is about highlighting states' primary responsibility to protect its people, okay, from the 4 specific crimes, okay, under international law. Okay, but at the same time, it seems like China tends to be very skeptical, or at least very critical of the Pillar 3, so-called Pillar 3 responsibility. So this is about highlighting the international community's role, okay, to assume, okay, that protection responsibility. And the primary reason is attributed, okay, to China's very strong resistance, okay, of its equal and independent footing of state sovereignty concept. Okay, and here, because of the time constraint, I'm not going to dig too deep, okay, into the China's foreign policy rationale and traditions, but basically what I would like to highlight here perhaps is the very important so-called twin principles of non-intervention in the domestic affairs of other states and the non-use of military force. I think, again, this is very important here for us to understand why China's positions on R2P keeps evolving, or this is also important for us to understand why China is being very supportive of the Pillar 1 responsibility, while being very skeptical, it's also very critical of the so-called Pillar 3 responsibility. I think in many ways, I think it is fair for us to suggest, okay, what the Chinese government, okay, is trying to do, okay, is to adopt, okay, what many scholars call the norm containment strategy. So this is basically about decoupling, okay, or at least or downplaying, okay, the linkage, okay, between the R2P, okay, and the use of the military force as a last resort. So in terms of summarizing China's overall stance, okay, towards R2P since its commitment, since its an aimless endorsement of the concept at the UN World Summit. I think this is basically what can be what I said in the quote. Some scholars suggest in the quote. Yeah. It's about preserving the vestige of its once firm stance on non-interference, like a requirement for whole states' consent for collective military deployment, without appearing to completely turn a blind eye to mass atrocities. So, in other words, what China is trying to do is about striking a balance between the preservation, okay, of the state's sovereignty, as well as its commitment, okay, to protecting the world's vulnerable population from genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. Okay, in terms of understanding China's commitment, okay, to the R2P, okay, there are some evidence suggesting that China's thus trying to be very active, okay, in terms of its participation in, for example, in its peacekeeping, in UN's peacekeeping activities. I think in many ways, so this could be attributed to some scholars suggest so-called image-related considerations, because China wants to be seen as a positive contributor, okay, to the international peace and security, and this can be seen. Can be seen in terms of its active participation, active contribution to the UN peacekeeping forces in recent years. And at the same time, it can also be explained. This is about China's attempt, okay, to promote its project, okay, its a positive image as a so-called responsible great power. But of course, I think it is also very important here for us to highlight that while China is trying to make its efforts, okay, to project itself as a responsible great power in terms of endorsing the ultimate principle, as well as contributing actively to the UN peacekeeping activities. Okay, but at the same time, what we are seeing here is China still remains to be very skeptical, but also very critical, okay, of the so-called Pillar 3 responsibility, because of the fact that China or the Beijing authorities has been very critical of, for example, as we can see from China's Security Council's behavior. For example, during the crisis of the 2012, the Syrian civil war. Okay, China, along with Russia, okay, they veto, okay, the UN resolutions in addressing, okay, the crisis engulfing Syria. So basically, what we are seeing here is about China's very skeptical and sort of critical attitudes towards the implementation of R2P, because of China's skeptical of the Western powers' attempt, okay, to trigger regime change in the case of the civil war in Libya, as well as in Syria. So that partially explains why China has been very critical and skeptical of triggering or supporting the so-called Pillar 3 responsibility. Okay, so some very brief concluding remarks in which I would like to make here is the following. Okay, first is China's commitment to the R2P at the UN World Summit in 2005 is that even though, okay, we have witnessed China has been very supportive of the Pillar 1 responsibility, but still the thing is China does believe that the Security Council does not have any sufficient mandate, okay, to interpret R2P, okay, beyond the scope of that commitment. So definitely not carrying a regime change, okay, just like what some Western powers were trying to do in the case of addressing, okay, the civil war in Libya and Syria. Okay, and concluding remarks number 2 is China has been very cautious in terms of resisting, okay, any attempts to further expand R2P, particularly its Pillar 3 responsibility, okay, as well as the initiative to invoke R2P in the UN Security Council proceedings. And also China has been consistent in terms of maintaining that, okay, this R2P principle, as well as its implementation, okay, should be a matter, okay, for the UN General Assembly to further clarify, okay, as well as to build up any consensus for its further implementation. Okay, and in this sense, okay, China's endorsement of the R2P principle, as I argue, okay, does not signify the radical departure of its foreign policy tradition. So this is about its emphasis on the principle of the non-interference in the domestic affairs of other member states. Okay, and also what we are seeing here is China does maintain that protection, civilian protection, is best achieved through prevention, in particular Pillar 1 responsibility. This is about highlighting the state's primary responsibility to protect its people. And so in this sense, I think it is fair for us to suggest China its endorsement of the R2P principle still is very important for us to see the implementation of R2P in the coming years is still to be a matter of concern. In other words, okay, emerging powers like China's, I think their views and their position on R2P, it is very important, okay, for the international policymakers to engage the views and positions of China and some other emerging powers, so as to, like I said, to translate the promise of R2P from rhetoric to reality. So this is basically what I would like to share at this moment. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy, okay, to answer any questions on the floor, just in case. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for listening and your patience.
So much. Thank you so much, Dr. Raymond. It's really insightful talk from your end. And you rightly pointed out, and I would, just add one line from Spider-Man, that with great power comes great responsibility. So this word is not from me, it's from Spider-Man culture. So I think you will be rightly put it out that this world, China is actually having so much power in the point of economically particularly and rather politically also to some extent. Uh, Great responsibility is already been there. So, and China wouldn't be actually uh, not very much into this responsibility terms. So, I think with your more research, in-depth research, would definitely guide China, particularly to do, and the policymakers would have the right decision onto this. So, I open for discussions and like to ask something directly to Raymond, would like happily to answer them. Kindly unmute yourself and can ask a question that you would like to. Kajal ma'am, would you like to ask something to Dr. Raymond or anyone else? Okay, if not, I have one question to ask. What would be your recommendation for the international relation, particularly with India, China? I would like to point it out that I'm really hopeful that because I was in China and I have a very good relationship with my Chinese friends over there, but how we can actually improve India-China relation, international relationships in terms of economical exchange more likely.
Okay. Because of the time constraint, actually, I don't actually have the time to discuss further, for example, India's policy stance on R2P. But I think, simply speaking, India, somewhat similar, does share similar concerns, like China. I mean, on the one hand, like India, just like other UN member states, did endorse the R2P principle at the 2005 UN summit. Okay, but just like the Chinese government, the Indian government does have some concern regarding the potential abuse of the R2P, particularly when R2P or the implementation of R2P, say in the case of Libya, was being effectively translated into the exercise of regime change. Okay, in this sense, definitely R2P shouldn't be elaborated or distorted into justifying this exercise of regime change, because this is not exactly or not supposedly what R2P principle is supposed to mean. And so I think, in my opinion, the R2P implementation did have encounter some sort of resistance, if not oppositions, particularly from the developing countries, because I think it is totally understandable for developing countries to have a heavier emphasis on the preservation and defense of state sovereignty and territorial integrity, other than the promotion or protection of universal human rights, because of the history, right? Because of the history of Western imperialism and colonialism. Because actually, say many countries say in Asia, they once the victim, right? They were once subject to this Western imperialism colonialism. So that has made those countries to become very cautious of any, say, the debate, a discussion surrounding humanitarian intervention, right? Because for countries like those who were once subject under Western imperialism colonialism, okay, they did see state sovereignty as the last line of defense. So in this sense, I think R2P's implementation, this is the reason why I suggest it's very important for international policymakers, particularly the so-called developed countries, okay, to take those concerns, I mean, from the developing countries into account, particularly by not making R2P's implementation as something like triggering regime change, okay, like what was happening in Libya and in Syria. I think it is very important for us to further engage the emerging powers, and by further elaborating and clarifying the contents and the meaning of R2P, particularly the scope of R2P, in order not to make the concept being abused or misused or distorted by developed countries. Because the reason why R2P was born, and the reason why R2P was being universally endorsed, is it was meant to transcend the so-called North-South divide, right? Just like, and definitely in this sense, R2P is not supposed, okay, to be a reincarnation of so-called humanitarian intervention. It is something different, something more than just about humanitarian intervention or the use of military force or the right in the. Yes, so I think this.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. Shair Ahmed would like to ask related with Kashmir, but here for today's particular webinar is not related with that. But Shair, I really request you, if you would like to connect with Dr. Raymond directly, that would be wonderful. I will share Dr. Raymond's email ID to all of you. Dr. Raymond, it would be wonderful if you just type your email ID in the chat box, or your any kind of books is available on the particular topic. So this audience would be great enough. Yes, that's wonderful. So Shair, I would really request to raise the question directly to Raymond. That would be wonderful, because we are running out of time. We will definitely have Raymond for another session, definitely for more in-depth discussion, because it's a never-ending discussions on particularly humanitarian and human rights issues nowadays, what's going on all over the world, not related with India, Kashmir or India, China, but all over the world is under threat. And we need to raise the voice. And that's why I thought that let's utilize the time of this particular, when we are not able to travel all over the world, let's utilize and hear some positive responses from the experts like Dr. Raymond. It was like a more awaiting, more precious today's webinar, because I was expecting Dr. Raymond for the previous series of webinar in the month of July and August. But due to time constraint, Dr. Raymond wouldn't have to make that possible. But I really, really thank you for today's particular session, because it's full of information, full of data, which is very important for the interpretation and the more in-depth with a proper methodological approach of study. So I request all of you, if you would really connect with Dr. Raymond. Raymond is a wonderful person and always try to help others. I know him personally from, I think, from years. and we are connected in social media. And thanks to social media, because now we are all connected with this social media. So here I'm with a positive note, I'm going to wrapping up the sessions. Thank you so much, all of you, and particularly my heartfelt gratitude to Raymond. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Swati, once again for your very kind invitation. Yeah, I look forward to continuing this dialogue, and yeah, hopefully our paths will cross again in the
Thank you.
future.
Thank you. Take
Yeah,
care. Have a wonderful evening, all of you.
yeah, thank you all. Yeah, thank you for nice to meeting you all. Yeah, see you. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.